Okay, hello everyone. Good morning to those of you who are joining us as well. Let me get that situated here. All right. Well, this is spring break week for some of the local schools as well, so I'm sure that's changing everyone's patterns also and whatnot. Great to see all of y'all scattered about the room. And you're sitting in a different place, Caroline. I'm going to be very confused. All right. Oh, my goodness. Well, we're continuing in our study of Ruth today. And as I've been doing each week, I want to begin with a poem from Padraig Ochwanga. This one is called Once Upon a Time Bomb. The stories we've told were carefully molded with not so lightly chosen terminology. Words avoided, and what was told aloud was certainly not as loud as what was shrouded by our mutually unagreed silence. Because violence, while it is deep in us, is not what sleeps deepest in us. And the question is, can I see my face when I face my own history from where you've faced it? And the question is, can we create the space that holds us and molds us in our bodies so that we embody who and what we can be with one another? Not as depressing as last week's poem. Perhaps, yeah. So I want to remind us, first of all, that we got partly through the biblical text of the first chapter last week, and we're going to pick up, if you're following along in the book, I'm still in the middle of chapter 2, I think. I think it's chapter 2. We didn't make it all the way through that last week. But in the biblical text, in chapter 1, we were introduced, remember, to Ruth and Naomi and that whole situation, right? And she's urging her daughters-in-law not to go with her back to her home country and all that, right? One of the interesting things to point out about the text is, and I think we might have alluded to this last week, but almost every, I think with one exception, every time Ruth is referred to in this text, she is listed as Ruth the Moabite. Yeah. So why is that? Well, it's because the label mattered in this context, right? It would be like us saying Pedro the Mexican, right? Or Carla the African, or John the Texan. It's used because the whoever wrote this, in the way the story was handed down, they had to emphasize that she was a foreigner in a strange land. It just went with her. It became part of her name in this thing. And so with that in mind, we come to this passage that we just brushed up against last week. That's one of the most beloved passages. When we talk about how out of context we typically take it, right? Where Ruth is saying to Naomi in the middle of chapter 1, "Do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." There is in this language some very curious language. And this whole thing about Ruth clinging to Naomi, at its root, has a sexual connotation to it. Now, I'm not saying Ruth and Naomi were having a sexual relationship, but it's that some people, whatever. The point is, this is an intimate connection. This is not just, oh yeah, I think I'll stay with you. This is, I will cling to you. I will stay next to you, by your side. It's not a casual decision that's being made here, right? And then when Naomi realizes that she's determined, she says no more to her. The other interesting thing, if you back up and read this all through, you will see that Ruth and Orpah say to Ruth 3 times, we want to go with you. And in the Jewish tradition, there is this pattern where you ask for something 3 times and it's denied. And if you really are sincere about it, you've got to go to 3 times, right? That's a pattern here. So to the Jewish reader or hearer of this story, that pattern would really matter in this. And so we have to pay attention to that as well. We talked about famine last week and how that goes into this. The author of our study book says, the plot of the book of Ruth is a subtle mix of things that cannot be controlled and things that can be controlled. It's a mix of things that cannot be controlled and things that can be controlled. And isn't that life for us? Now we're to the serenity prayer, right here in the book of Ruth, right? Ruth and Naomi are trying to control the things they can, but a lot of it is out of their control. And there's so many examples of this we could give in life. I want to lay that aside for a minute. We'll come back to it. In the Jewish tradition, within something called the Midrash, which is the rabbinic teaching, one of the questions that's asked about this story is, why was Elimelech, Naomi's husband, why does he appear to have been punished in the way that we talked about last week? And we mentioned that a little bit. This is why Naomi changes her name from sweet to bitter as she comes back home, right? The author, this is set against the context of Brexit and the troubles in Northern Ireland in the book. In the course of our project on Brexit in the book of Ruth, we encountered a lot of discussion about Ruth's beautiful lines, where you go, I will go. Some saw Ruth's assertion as a demonstration of love for her mother-in-law. Others asked whether there could have been an erotic link between the women, and indeed there's linguistic reason, as I just described, about that. Still others wondered if Ruth had become a convert to the Jewish faith, we talked about this last week, that she saw in her beloved Naomi. The final consideration is also the subject of much speculation from the rabbis, and as I mentioned, in the Midrash, it's noted that Naomi ordered Ruth and Orpah to turn back 3 times, much as any potential convert to Judaism is refused 3 times in order to test their resolve. There's the connection to this. Most of the questions we have about the story here, though, are unanswerable to us because we don't have all the details to it. And the writer here in this chapter says, when borders and their narratives are disputed, the story about those borders also is disputed. When borders and their narratives are disputed. So in this case, Moab, Ruth the Moabite, Moab is a neighboring country, and it's a territory that was associated with great animosity, right? So this is why Ruth is called Ruth the Moabite over and over again. The Moabites had a bad reputation among the Israelites, and the other way around, they hated each other. The author explains, neither territory like the other, and stories were told in Israel that caricatured the women of Moab as sex-crazed people. Along these lines, one strange little throwaway text in the Midrash on Ruth suggests, now I'm just reading what the author said here, these are not my words, y'all just brace yourself, okay? One little throwaway text in the Midrash on Ruth suggests that, quote, everyone who saw her orgasmed. Why would this be? The crudity of the statement projects dripping sexuality onto Ruth, but even a simple exploration of this sentence should begin to query the everyone rather than the her. Okay? So now this may seem far-fetched to you until you think back in our own American history about how sexualized our racial discrimination in Jim Crow South in slavery times was, right? Allison and I went last Sunday afternoon to see the Dallas Opera performance of a contemporary opera called Flight. And I won't go into the whole story of it. But amongst several things that troubled me about this production, one of them was that there's a male character in here who turns out to be a Lothario, let's say, and is pretty much obsessed with anyone he can connect with. It's a subplot to the story. And unfortunately, in my view, they cast a black man in this role, which to me was a really stupid thing to do. Because if you look back at our own racial history, how many lynchings, how much of our history is bathed in false accusations of sexuality and sexual abuse and rape, right? That was all about protecting white women. And so here in our own history, we can understand something about the charges against Ruth in this context, because it may seem far-fetched, but remember that even our disputed southern border, one of the charges that's made is everyone who's coming across from Mexico is a rapist and a thug, right? So it gets sexualized as a way of scaring people. And that's what's happening here. This is the challenge that Ruth faces. She's coming back into Israel with a reputation, because she's Ruth the Moabite, that she has some deviance about her. That's what this is about. And the connection here is to think about how, to go back to the poem that we read this morning earlier, how our stories about where we've come from help us shape these things, right? The stories we've been told. Because by this point, Ruth, the Moabites and the Israelites, this was such an old war that the stories that were fueling it, no one living knew, right? This is like the Hatfields and the McCoys, who just got so used to shooting at each other that they couldn't even remember why they were shooting at each other. And that's what we see here. And my God, what a relevant lesson for the moment in which we live, right? When you think about the war in Ukraine, it is all about borders and boundaries. Because Putin, in his demented state, and I use that word intentionally, Putin has this grand vision of restoring the splendor of Russia as it was under the czars. And he sees himself as a modern day czar. And so he is going to break down a border and a boundary that he doesn't like in order to accomplish his vision, and everyone else be damned in the process, right? So really, this is about a border that's been erected that is more powerful than he realized, as it turns out, right? More powerful than he realized. So I had a school board member invite me for coffee week before last. Did I tell you all this story already? No. So I had a school board member invite me, an RSV school board member, because I've been a little outspoken about support for public education and against book bannings and all that stuff. And so this school board member invited me he wanted to hear some of what I had to say, and he had some helpful things to say to me as well. And I had sort of accused some of the Richardson school board members of being Trojan horses getting elected on one promise and then getting there and letting a superintendent walk away because they didn't support her, which I still think is largely true. But we had a very helpful conversation. And one of the most fascinating things the school board member said to me was, from his observation, what's going on in the school debates today is about a border and a boundary. And it is, where is the line between what is home and what is school? In caring for kids, how much does the home invade into the school, and how much does the school invade into the home? Now, there are some ways we can largely agree that the school has a responsibility to invade into what would otherwise be home territory. And a great example of this is free and reduced lunch programs. So if you have kids who are coming to school unable to learn because they lack sufficient food at home, it is in everyone's best interest for the school to be able to feed them and help them have nutrition. And we've taken this so far, thankfully, and Wilshire has helped with this in other schools before, so that sometimes we even send food home with kids on the weekend in backpacks, right? We've helped with this before. Well, there's the school encroaching into home territory, but it's for the life and health and safety of the kid, right? Yet there are other times that you may not want the school coming into home because you may say, wait, there's a barrier, you're not going to teach my kid X, Y, or Z, right? And here's the challenge that we face, because some parents are okay with the border being here, and some parents are okay with the border being here. Some parents don't even know there's a border. So how do you navigate this? And the thing the school board member said to me is, this is a border that's always shifting, and this is the source of our conflict. And I thought, well, you know, that's really brilliant. And it goes straight to our lesson from Ruth about defining these borders, because, you know, just the way Ruth gets labeled Ruth the Moabite, teachers and administrators today can get labeled that liberal teacher, or that socialist teacher, or that whatever teacher, right? And parents can get labeled in the same way, one way or the other. And it's this constant struggle to define where's the line. And I'm wondering, what do some of y'all think about that as we think about borders and boundaries?
I think if parents are going to be so demanding of schools, they've got to start acting like parents.
So say more.
There's just a lot of kids that have such little at home, and they come to school for those things.
Right.
To, you know, and teachers are just put in a terrible position.
Yes.
Because home may be horrible due to nothing the kid's responsible for. And yet, if you try to institute too many social things at school, you've got parents that don't want that.
Right.
It's usually not the horrible parents, it's the...
Right. And so it's flexible. The needs are flexible. Someone else on this? Yeah, Henry?
The official that you talked to, did he say, does he think that today the parents are increasing or lowering the bar or boundary?
So Henry's asking, did the school board member think parents are increasing or lowering the bar? And I think the answer is both.
Yeah.
This is the problem. It's not equal.
There's so many homeschools going on now.
And there's the homeschooling going on, right?
Well, I teach in a private school, so it's a different situation. But for me, the place where I'm accused of encroaching is when I say, you have to come to school. You can't just skip school anytime you feel like it. Because people who are paying tuition figure they can come when they want and not come when they don't want.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Yeah, Lynette?
I was raised in Southeast Oklahoma, and at that time, it was interesting. My mother was the first African American teacher at the elementary school which I attended. And you talk about boundaries, and my mother was the one that told these little kids, you gotta wash your underarms, honey, cause you stink. She was the one that told these kids that you can't do this or you can't do that because of. And I'm sure that there were probably parents who thought that my mother was encroaching upon their boundaries. And 50 years later, I hear those kids, those same kids who say, because of your mother, I'm the person who I am today.
Exactly.
I am the person that I am because I understood that your mother didn't care whether I was black or white or yellow or orange. When I stunk, she told me. So it's really interesting to me how those blendings do. And if not for some teachers, some kids probably would not have some of the values that they have today. They would not have some
Right.
of the maybe some even the jobs that they have today. So I can understand how that can be really kind of shifty.
Yeah. No, thank you. So for those at home, Lynette's talking about growing up in southeastern Oklahoma, and her mother was the first African American teacher in that district, and the challenges she faced, and you know, on simple things like hygiene, helping. Probably, I'm imagining 5th and 6th grade boys.
Probably.
I understand they needed to deal with body odor. This was long before Axe spray, right? And those types of things. That's sort of that's a home kind of thing, but yet it matters in this context. And all of this is just an illustration to help us understand that everywhere around us we have borders and boundaries we're dealing with. This is the root. Beyond the physical borders of our country, this is also at root, it's so much of the culture wars in America today and in other parts of the world. Where is the state's right versus the individual right on abortion? Where is the state's right versus the individual right on care for transgender kids in Texas right now? Where is the state's right versus the individual's right on access to general health care? You know, all of these, and we've made decisions along the way that sort of, well, like for example, like it or not, somewhere back in the New Deal, America decided we need to make sure everyone has a basic retirement. We're going to call this Social Security, so that we don't have so many people on the welfare rolls because they don't have any retirement, right? And so this was a way to address that, but that crossed a border. It crossed a boundary. And these are all choices we make. And here's where Ruth and Naomi figure into this story, because they illustrate for us the challenges that come with this. Does this make sense? Or am I just like off on a tangent? Sometimes when you're looking for a yellow convertible, you always find a yellow convertible. But,
Yesterday I found myself thinking about the Ukraine and Russia, and I found myself thinking about when being in high school and doing the civil defense drills.
Oh,
We had to go
right.
down in the basement because Nikita Khrushchev was going to blow us to kingdom come.
Right.
And I thought, you know, Mr. Putin wants us to go back there. And but then my mind went to, well, Russia's just always been evil.
Mm.
Because that's the way I was raised, to think of Russia as this great, horrible, evil
Right.
people who wanted to kill us. And it's hard not to think that way now when you see what's going on.
Yeah, so Linda, thanks for that. For those at home, Linda's talking about being raised in a time of bomb practices in schools and air raid sirens and all that, which many of us can identify with that. And we as Americans of a certain age, were trained to think of Russia as evil, right? And that still conditions most of us, although some people seem to get over that pretty well. But it is an interesting thing, because we're going to go back to that wonderful song from South Pacific, you have to be carefully taught to hate, right? That's just a classic example. You have to be carefully taught to hate. And this is what Ruth and Naomi are facing as they go back to Israel. So what happens in the story is, at the end of, remember we talked about how this is the first, there are 4 acts of the story? You're right there. At the end of the first act, they appear back in Bethlehem And it just so happens all the inhabitants of the city, this is why I think this is fiction, right? One of the reasons, all the inhabitants of the city are out because Boaz's wife has died, and they're all out for the funeral. Well, this is a great theatrical device, right? This is how we meet the Greek chorus here, because they're mourning a funeral, and enter Naomi and Ruth from this other side, right? And the commentator here talks about this literally being like a Greek chorus. So let me pause. Susan?
Wasn't one of the reasons that the Israelites hated the Moabites so much was because of that time somewhere in the past where they had really needed help because of their famine, and or maybe the Israelites were traveling through, I don't remember what the history was, and the Moabites would not help them at all.
You know, I'm not sure about the answer to that. So Susan's asking if one of the causes of the hatred was that during the famine, the Moabites would not help the Israelites.
I thought I read that.
Yeah, that could be.
I'm thinking
Did
you
you
were
read
right
that
with the traveling thing, that they weren't allowed to pass through Moab.
Oh, it's in the book. Yeah, that tells you how carefully I read the book. I actually have read it carefully. I'm old.
It's okay, that's why we're here.
Yeah, I'm old. So this leads us then to this conversation that we touched on last week. The authors here say to return home is no return at all. He says, I wonder regularly what Naomi meant to do if she had been allowed to travel back alone. She was empty already, and she's even changed her name from sweet to bitter. So I usually assume she wished to walk into her own ending in the in-between borders between the place she came from and the place she went to. This is a fascinating question. In this story, if Ruth had not gone with Naomi, things would have gone differently for Ruth. I mean, for Naomi as well as for Ruth. So there's a sense in which Ruth becomes Naomi's own salvation in this. Isn't that just the way life works, right? Yeah, Pat?
Would Ruth have been shunned if she had gone back to Moabites, knowing that she had been married to an Israelite?
Yes,
Okay.
I think so.
There was no upside for Ruth.
Yeah, so Ruth, well, for Naomi, yeah. Or
For
Ruth,
Ruth,
yeah, for both
because
of them.
because in Moab she was hated because she married an Israelite, and in Israel she was hated because she was a Moabite. So
Right.
there was no winning for her.
Bringing this back to the troubles in Ireland, the author explains here, in one congregation in Dublin, we asked people, what do your people hold against people from other jurisdictions around Ireland and Britain? There were folks with links to both Irish jurisdictions, there, as well as Welsh, Scottish, and English. There was even a Cornish person in the mix. We asked the question. Someone said, I wouldn't like to repeat such things in church. We laughed, but we said, try. Try, because it's better to name the things we hold against each other for all the truthing, birthing, dying, changing energies that are needed. What is not remembered is repeated, Freud said. Let me say that one again. What is not remembered is repeated.
Yeah.
So we remembered hatreds and pains, and there were many. Our language was taken. My son was murdered. Our place was terrorized. Our reputation was ridiculed. You discover new things when you name your hatreds of people to the people who are part of those peoples. Wow, that is just astonishingly powerful, right? Yeah, Pat.
I think I said before that I'm from Ireland, my grandparents, all that kind of stuff. But actually, we're Scot-Irish, and we were told when we were over there that the conflict started back when the Scottish people came over, took out all the good farmland and pushed the other people away. So that was part of the,
Yeah, so again, you gotta get back to the origin story.
and that's, our people were farmers in Northern Ireland, so.
Right, and it's very challenging to change a narrative that we've been taught. And Exhibit A for us here in Texas if you recall, within the past year, the hullabaloo that ensued when some scholars have published a book retelling the story of the Alamo.
Yeah.
Y'all remember this? I mean, it's pretty well documented now what they've got to say, but it defies the heroic narrative of the people we've made movies about as being pure as driven snow. And it turns out they really weren't, and that they were probably inept as well, right? And that sort of rattled people's cages. Like, no, we can't change that story. We can't change that.
The story served a purpose at the time, but the truth is, and I've read this many times, there was no reason to defend the Alamo.
Right.
It served no purpose other than to turn into a rallying cry.
Well, right. So the story of the Alamo becomes really a propaganda piece in a sense, right? And does that ever happen anywhere else? Yeah. We've seen this over and over and over again. But this is the power, and this what they did in Ireland and bringing people together to have these conversations was they found healing in telling the stories out loud, the ones that had been suppressed, because they were motivating actions, and it's always better to name the demon than to let the demon go unnamed. The demon has power when unnamed.
Right. Call the devil by his name.
Yeah.
Well, I was of course thinking of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Committee and how that worked too, but that also, in individual therapy you learn about, your shadow self and that kind of thing, repressing and not letting that out. But this is kind of a way in which, what am I trying to say, a more global way of having that psychoanalysis.
Yes, no, you're exactly right. I'm thinking the very same thing. There's a direct comparison here because whether working on an individual level or a community level, being able to name the things that are shaping us, right?
I remember on a trip to Israel, walking with a group of people in my tour group, someone asked the tour guide, is there ever any marriage between Jews and Arabs? His response was not, oh, God forbid. It was, God forbid. He spit it out.
Yeah.
And the rest of us went, like, oh, don't touch that subject.
Right.
After a little bit, he said, well, every once in a while there'd be some stupid Jewish girl. Always blame the women.
Of course. Right, of course.
So these things die slowly. And they just
Well, and my goodness, think about how much of our great classic literature is built around this very theme. I mean, this is Romeo and Juliet, which becomes West Side Story, right? This is just story after story after story that gets dramatized, that gets novelized, because we all understand how this works, right? It's so much a part of human nature, and it's in the Bible from the beginning all the way through. These very stories of borders and boundaries defining who people are. You're in, you're out, right? And yet, in the New Testament, we see Jesus coming to break down barriers and to eat with tax collectors and sinners and bring people into the kingdom of God who wouldn't otherwise be there. And that makes sense when we understand the Old Testament tradition that leads up to this. That's also our story, right? That's why we study the book of Ruth in this.
I was thinking about borders are seen from different people from different ways too. You're talking about shifting.
Right.
'Cause I'm from Arkansas and I always thought I was a Southerner. No, I'm a Westerner, as far as west of the Mississippi.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing. Just for those at home, Pat's comment was borders look different depending on which way you're looking at them, right? And that is so true, so true. I was in and out of the car yesterday, and I was listening to one of those NPR shows. I don't even know what it was, and they were interviewing several students and parents who had had trouble during the pandemic being in and out of school. And there was this one girl named Maricela who, her family she was in the middle of her 6th grade year. And when the school closed, they up and went to Mexico to take care of her grandparents, who both ended up dying of COVID in the house where they were staying with them. She missed her entire 7th grade year, came back, they moved back to LA, and she started 8th grade having missed a year and a half of school, right? And the interviewer says to her something to the effect of, well, you know, why is it that you left school? And the 8th grader's response is, I didn't leave school, school left me.
I've got a child in my class whose mom kept him home the year of the quarantine. She said, well, I was going to homeschool, and my 2 older children did what I told them to, but this one wouldn't do anything, so he just did nothing for a whole year. And if you ask him, he says, well, I skipped school for a year.
So here again, the way we see this depends on where we are, right? To this student, the school had closed and left her. To the school, this student left and didn't come back, right? And we tend to always tell the story from one perspective and not from both.
Yeah, and I feel for him, but this child now just staunchly refuses to do anything because he's had a year and a half of doing absolutely nothing.
So we're almost out of time. I just want to close this unit by saying what we're about to venture into is to see how Ruth becomes the most unexpected change agent in a system, right? She takes on a holy kind of role that we could not anticipate. And this is one of the beauties of this story, is that out of her distress, out of her crossing this border, out of all this, something good happens, but we've got to wait to get to that something good. We can't cover everything in one lesson today. So we'll conclude with that, and I will lead us in a prayer for those who are joining us online, and then we'll have our prayer concerns here in the class as well. Lord, thank you for the blessings of this day and for the opportunity to discuss and learn, and we pray that you continue to help us as we seek to be border breakers and boundary crossers for the sake of your love. Give us courage, we pray. Through Jesus Christ. Amen.
So where will we start in the